pivots into the holes. Take your time. Work from the bottom up and never force a pivot. When a few of the lower pivots are in their holes, install the lower pillar nuts and tighten them finger tight. This will help to keep the pivots that are already in their holes from coming out again. Continue to ease more of the pivots into place. When most of the pivots are in the holes, add the upper pillar nuts. This stage of the repair can be frustrating. Some pivots may pop out of the holes repeatedly. This usually happens because these pivots are slightly shorter than the others in the movement. Keep at it and all the pivots will go into their holes. If the first assembly takes you a half hour, the next one may go more quickly. It is true that some movements are just easier to assemble than others. It is usually easier to add the pallets at the end of the assembly procedure. With the mainspring still completely let down, separate the plates just enough to allow the pallet arbor pivots to go into their holes. Check for any other pivots, such as those for the escape arbor and fly, that may have come out. Make sure that none of the pivots is jammed against the plate. Check the escapement action and look again for any pivots that are not in the holes. At this point, attach any brass wire springs that operate the strike arbors. In this particular movement, the springs are permanently attached flat brass springs. Tighten all the nuts only after all the pivots are seated properly. If the nuts are used to force the plates down on a pivot that is not in place, the pivot may bend or break. With a little care, this will not happen. Before we begin the repair, let's take a close look inside the clock movement. It will give you some insight into what we are trying to accomplish in a typical repair. The brass movement consists of two plates which act as supports and bearings for the various shafts or arbors. There are two sets of gear trains, one for timekeeping, the other for striking. Each set of gears is called a train. This is a two-train movement, with the strike on the left and the time on the right. In addition, there is a set of gears called the dial train, which converts the once per hour rotation of the minute hand to the once in 12-hour rotation of the hour hand. The dial train is usually considered a part of the time train. The time train. The power to drive the main wheel is provided by the mainspring, which we have already learned to let down safely. The mainspring of this assembled movement is still providing power to the second wheel by way of its pinion. The power enters the second wheel, proceeds to the third wheel, fourth wheel, and finally up to the escape wheel. Now we come to the function of the escapement. It is made up of an escape wheel, pallets, and pendulum. The escapement allows the time train wheels to turn at a controlled rate. The time train wheels turn in small motions, one motion for each tick. The pendulum determines the rate at which this occurs. The shorter the pendulum, the faster the clock runs. More details on the function of the escapement will be discussed later. The strike train. Let's look inside the strike train. It is actuated on the hour or hour and half hour. The rest of the time, the strike train is at rest. When the train is activated, the train wheels begin turning. The strike train uses a governor, which clockmakers call the fly, to control its speed. Without it, the strike train would run away at a ruinous speed and destroy itself. The wheel that determines the number of strikes that should occur each hour is known as the count wheel. The typical American count wheel has a pre-programmed pattern of slots designed to provide all of the hammer strokes for a 12 or 24-hour period. Each tooth represents one hammer stroke. Each deep slot is the end of a striking sequence. Note how the interval between deep slots increases as the hours progress. Let's watch the clock go through its striking routine. 5 to 7 minutes before the hour, the star cam on the center arbor raises the strike lifting lever. In a sudden motion, the train is unlocked for the warning. The locking wheel and pin run until stopped by the warning lever. The strike train is now held until the hour. The star cam releases the strike lifting lever and the clock begins to strike. It continues until the count lever reaches the next deep slot in the count wheel. The locking pin now catches on the locking lever to stop the train. Strike train adjustment. All of this activity doesn't look too difficult until you run into a movement which has suffered bent levers. Then the fun begins. So let's go through the adjustment of the strike train. The count and drop levers are usually mounted on the same arbor. This means that whatever is done to one lever affects the other one. So let's watch what happens when these two levers move into action. The count lever is flattened into the shape of a blade. The blade should point radially toward the center of the strike winding arbor. Adjust this first, using a bending lever. Now look at the drop lever. Rotate the wheels until the drop lever falls into the slot in the cam. The count lever should now dip toward the count wheel. When the clock reaches the end of a striking sequence, the count lever must enter a deep slot. As the clock strikes, the count lever should rise above the count wheel. The drop lever should be riding on the rim of the cam. When the count lever is in the locking slot, the drop lever should be in its own slot in the cam. Another lever, the locking lever, is typically mounted on the same arbor with the other two levers. The locking lever stops the locking pin, which is mounted on the fourth strike wheel, also called the locking wheel. This action occurs just as the count and drop levers enter the slots. As the drop lever enters the slot, the locking pin should meet the locking lever. If it does not, you must make sure all power has been released from both mainsprings before making the adjustment. Separate the plates just enough to allow you to ease the rear pivot of the locking wheel out of its hole. Leave the drop lever and third wheel where they are, and move the locking wheel. Carefully place the locking pin next to the locking lever. Put the plates together and check the adjustment. You may have to do it twice, or even a half dozen times until you get it right. With this adjustment complete, the strike train will lock when the count lever enters a deep slot. If it is not done right, the clock will strike continuously. Next, you must make sure the locking lever will actually stop the pin. This often requires a bending adjustment. We don't want the clock to stop striking until the sequence is over. Make the clock begin to strike, but slow the wheels with your finger. Just as the count lever dips toward the rim, stop the action and watch the locking pin as it moves past the locking lever. The clearance will be small, but there must be clearance each time. Remember, the adjustment works two ways. When you increase the locking, you decrease the clearance during striking. When you decrease the locking, you obtain more clearance at the other end. If there is no clearance, the clock will not strike. If too much, it will not stop striking. If the pin just nicks the lever at each pass, the clock will strike with a rapid ticking sound that is sometimes hard to locate. Strike warning. The strike warning is a mechanism that prepares the strike train for activation. It occurs 5 to 7 minutes before the hour strike. To adjust the strike warning mechanism, install the minute hand. Allow the movement to tick rapidly with the pendulum off near the strike warning point. Do not turn the hands past the warning point because you will not be able to observe the warning mechanism properly. Allow the minute hand to advance rapidly to the warning point. As the warning approaches, the center cam will raise the lifting lever. At the same time, observe the unlocking lever. It will lift up the count lever. This lifting and unlocking action determines the warning point. If the warning point does not occur 5 to 7 minutes before the hour, adjust the warning. Bend the unlocking lever up for an earlier warning and down for a later warning. Once the warning point has been established, stop the pendulum and check to see where the lock pin locks on the warning lever. The locking must be safe, but if it is too much, the lock pin cannot clear the lever later when the clock strikes. Bend the warning lever carefully. It usually isn't necessary to touch it unless someone has been into the movement before you with pliers. Now continue to watch the hand move toward the hour. The center cam will drop the lifting lever to cause the strike to begin. The first thing to observe is whether the strike began early or late. In an American clock, the hand does not usually have a bushing for adjustment, so you must bend the lifting lever instead. In a typical clock, bend the lever down as shown to make the strike occur later. Bend it up to make the strike happen earlier. This is an important adjustment, often overlooked. Some repairers bend the minute hand instead, but this is wrong. The hand must be distorted very badly just to change the strike point by 1 minute. If the movement strikes the half hours on the train, that is, by the running of the strike gears, you probably will not have to adjust it separately. But if it has a passing strike, which involves another lifting lever, the train does not turn at the half hour. The hammer is lifted once, and that is all. Adjust the half-hour passing strike in the same way. Time train. The most important mechanism in a mechanical clock is its escapement. The proper adjustment of the escape mechanism determines the dependability and accuracy of the clock. The escape mechanism is made up of an escape wheel, pallets, and pendulum. Most American clocks have strip pallets. The strip pallets, often called the verge, are bent into shape from a piece of flat steel. The ends of the strip are the pallets. These are hardened and polished. This type of escapement is the recoil type. If you watch it operate, you will see that the escape wheel recoils or backs up after each tick. This slow motion view